They had built something real together, or at least they had built something that looked real from the outside, which for a long time felt like the same thing. The beach house on Pelican Cove had been their proof. 3 years of savings, one difficult conversation about risk, and a shared signature on a deed that felt, in that moment, like a second set of wedding vows. But somewhere between the signing and the settling, the house stopped being theirs and started being a place where other people's needs arrived uninvited and stayed without asking. The trouble with Daniel and Claire was never loudness. It was the opposite. Two people who had grown so careful around each other that their silences had developed their own grammar, their own weight, their own slow way of saying everything neither of them could bring themselves to speak aloud. The drive to Pelican Cove took 3 hours and 40 minutes, and they had made it so many times that Daniel could have navigated it in his sleep. He knew exactly where the highway merged from 2 lanes into one near the Ashford exit, knew which gas station had the clean bathrooms and which one smelled of mildew no matter how new it looked from the road. He knew that Claire would fall asleep somewhere around the 90-minute mark and wake up 20 minutes before they arrived, slightly disoriented, her cheek creased from the seatbelt. These were the kinds of things you learned about a person after 11 years. They were also, Daniel sometimes thought, the kinds of things you stopped noticing you knew. It was a Friday in early September when the trouble began forming itself into something he could no longer ignore, though he would not understand that until much later. On that particular Friday, the light was still long and warm, and the salt smell hit them the moment he rolled down the windows outside Kingsford Bay. Claire stirred in the passenger seat, pressed her palms to her eyes in that habitual way she had. "We're close," she said. 20 minutes. She nodded and looked out the window, and there was a comfortable silence between them that felt entirely real. That was the thing about their marriage that made the rest of it so hard to parse. The comfort was genuine. He did love her. She loved him. These were not performances. The beach house was a pale blue Cape Cod with white shutters and a wraparound porch that caught the afternoon wind perfectly. They had repainted it 2 summers ago, the two of them up on ladders with brushes, arguing amiably about whether the original color had been more of a seafoam or a powder. It was theirs in the way that only a house you have bled some small amount for can ever be yours. What Daniel did not know, as he pulled into the shell gravel driveway, was that Claire had spoken to her mother 4 days earlier about the possibility of Renata and Gerald Whitmore using the house the following month. Not visiting, using. The language her mother had employed, and that Claire had not corrected, was the language of ownership, our place at the shore, when we're down at Pelican Cove, the Whitmore house. Claire's parents were people of a particular type that Daniel had spent 11 years learning to accommodate. Renata Whitmore was handsome in the way of a woman who had once been considered beautiful and had never quite forgiven time for revising that assessment. She was generous in visible ways and quietly possessive in ways that were harder to name. Gerald was softer, more oblique, a man who expressed his preferences through Renata and could therefore always claim innocence when those preferences caused friction. They were not malicious people. That was the important thing to understand, and also the thing that made everything so much more complicated. Inside the house, Daniel opened the windows while Claire unpacked the cooler. The sound of the ocean arrived in irregular waves, muffled and then clear. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, watching her, the efficient way she moved, the small hum she made when she was comfortable, and felt something that was not quite happiness, but was adjacent to it, a kind of recognition. "Your mother called me this week," he said, because it had occurred to him and seemed benign enough. "I know," Claire said. "She told me." A pause. She kept moving, arranging things in the refrigerator with her back to him. What did she want? Just to talk. Claire closed the refrigerator and turned around, and her expression was pleasant and easy. You know how she is. He did know how she was. That was the part he would turn over later, lying awake with the ocean doing its slow work outside. He had known exactly how her mother was, and he had let the pleasant expression on his wife's face reassure him, because it was easier, and because they were at the beach, and because the light through the kitchen window was golden and forgiving, and some moments you choose to let be uncomplicated, even when a quieter part of you understands they are not. They ate on the porch that night. Grilled fish, a bottle of white wine, the horizon going pink and then gray. It was a good evening in every measurable sense. When Claire reached across the table and touched the back of his hand, not reaching for it, just resting her fingers there briefly, the way you might touch something to confirm it's real, he turned his hand over and held hers. The water was still, which in hindsight should have felt like peace. It felt instead like the particular stillness that precedes a shift in weather. October arrived in stages. First, the angle of the light changed, going thin and lateral, the kind of light that illuminates rather than warms. Then the temperature dropped in the evenings. Then the weekend trips to Pelican Cove became alternating weekends, and then one weekend in 3, and Daniel told himself this was natural, the season turning, the house requiring less maintenance, both of them busier with work. He was a civil engineer for a mid-size firm in Hartwell. Claire managed operations for a boutique hotel group. They were not people who lacked things to do. What he noticed, more slowly, was a change in the texture of their conversations about the beach house. The house had always been a subject they returned to with ease. Plans for the back porch, whether to replace the kitchen faucet, which months got the best light. It had been a language they shared. But in October, the conversations grew slightly formal, slightly curated, as though Claire were choosing her words with an attention she usually reserved for work calls. One evening, she mentioned that her parents were thinking of spending some time at the coast before the cold fully set in. "How long?" Daniel asked. "A few weeks, maybe." She was looking at her laptop. "Maybe a bit longer. You know how they like it once the summer crowd thins out." "Sure," he said. And then, because something in him required acknowledgement, "They'd let us know, right? In advance?" "Of course." Still looking at the screen. "Obviously." He believed her. He believed her because he wanted to, and because there was no specific reason not to, and because the alternative, the beginning of a suspicion, the opening of a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered, required more energy than he had at 8:30 on a Tuesday. It was a week later that he found the email chain, and even then, he almost didn't understand what he was looking at. He had not been looking through Claire's things. He wanted to be precise about this, even in his own memory, even when there was no one to convince. He had been looking for a forwarded confirmation for a utility payment. Claire handled most of the household accounts, which had made sense when she'd taken that on, and which he had simply never renegotiated. And she had left her laptop open on the kitchen table. He saw his own name in a subject line. He stopped. The chain was between Claire and her mother, dating back 6 weeks. The subject line read, "Pelican Cove, Fall and Winter Use." He read it the way you read something when your hands have gone slightly cold and your breathing has adjusted without your permission. Renata Whitmore had proposed, with the confidence of someone who assumes their proposals are formalities, that she and Gerald would use the beach house from mid-October through February. She referenced in her characteristically offhand way some unspecified future arrangement in which the house would be managed differently. Claire had responded not with correction, but with logistics. "I'll make sure the linens are fresh. The heating system had some work done in August, so it should be fine." The logistics of someone managing an arrangement that had already been agreed upon. There was no email from Claire that said, "This is Daniel's house too, and he doesn't know about this." There was no email that said, "We should ask him." Daniel closed the laptop carefully, with both hands, the way you close something you intend to come back to. He went to the living room and sat down. The television was off. He could hear the refrigerator from there, that low mechanical hum. He stayed in that chair for a long time without moving, and in the silence it occurred to him, the thought arriving not dramatically but with a kind of weary clarity, that the situation had been developing for some time, and that the reason he hadn't seen it was not because it had been hidden well, but because he had cooperated, without knowing it, in his own not seeing. He sat with that for a while. Then he got up and went back to the kitchen and started making dinner, because Claire would be home in an hour. And because there was still such a thing as a normal evening, even on the days when something shifts inside you that cannot be shifted back. When she came through the door and said, "Smells good," and he said, "Pasta, nothing fancy," and she set down her bag and went to change. When all of that happened, there was a moment, brief and strange. When Daniel looked toward the space beyond the room, not at anything in particular, and said quietly, almost to himself, "I don't know. Maybe share this with someone or subscribe or something." Claire appeared in the hallway. "What?" He turned back to the stove. "Nothing. Talking to myself." She looked at him for a moment with mild, passing puzzlement, then went to get a glass of water, and the evening resumed its ordinary shape, and neither of them mentioned it again. He waited 4 days before saying anything. This was not cowardice, though he would later wonder. It was more that he needed to understand his own position before he could articulate it. He was someone who processed inward before speaking outward, and he had learned long ago that conversations begun from raw feeling rarely arrived anywhere useful. On the 4th day, a Saturday, they were at the kitchen table with coffee. The morning was overcast, that specific gray that makes indoor spaces feel sealed and honest. Daniel set down his cup and said, without preamble, "I saw the email chain about the beach house." Claire did not flinch. He had half expected her not to. "Which one?" she asked, and then, reading his expression, "Okay." "I want to understand what was decided," he said, "and when." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "My mother brought it up. She's been having a harder time this year with the winter. The cold affects her joints more than she lets on, and the coast helps. They wanted somewhere warm adjacent for a few months." "I understand that," Daniel said. "That's not the part I'm asking about." A short pause. "I know," she said. "The way she wrote about it, our place, when we're down there, that's not how we described it when we bought it. We were very specific about what it was. She talks like that." "You know she talks like that." "I do," he said. "I also know that you could have said, 'Mom, I need to talk to Daniel first,' and you didn't. And then when she started planning, you helped her plan." Claire looked at the table, not in a way that read as guilt exactly, more as someone encountering the accurate version of a story they'd been telling themselves slightly differently. "I didn't think it would become, 'I'm not angry,'" Daniel said, "and this was both true and incomplete. I want to be clear about that. I'm not raising my voice. I'm asking you a direct question, which is, was there a version of this where you were going to tell me?" The silence that followed was long enough to be its own answer. "I was going to figure out how to bring it up," she finally said. "That's different from telling me." "I know." He picked up his coffee and drank the last of it, which had gone cold. Outside, a bird moved across the gray sky in the window frame and disappeared. "There's something else," he said. The phrase, "managed differently," what does that mean? Claire's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "My mother has some ideas about..." "About what?" "About formalizing things. She thinks, and I want to be clear this is her thinking, not mine, she thinks it might make sense for the house to be part of a family arrangement, some kind of shared management." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "She wants partial ownership?" She didn't use that word. "She didn't need to." Claire pressed her fingers to her temple. "She's not a bad person, Daniel. She's just..." "I know she's not a bad person," he said. "That's not what I said. She's been saying since we bought it that it felt like a family investment. She helped us emotionally with the decision. She gave advice. We gave her a thank you dinner and she told us what color to paint the shutters," Daniel said, "and there was no heat in it. Only precision. That's not fair. I'm trying to be fair. I'm trying to be very accurate, actually, because I think accuracy matters here." He stood up and carried his mug to the sink, stood there with his back to her for a moment. "I need you to tell your mother that the house is ours, legally, fully, that we are happy to have them visit under reasonable arrangements, but that there is no family management structure, there is no reallocation, there is no shifting of what the deed says. And I need you to understand that I'm not doing this to be difficult or to score a point. I'm doing it because if we don't establish this now, it will only get larger." When he turned around, Claire looked tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. "She's going to be upset," she said. "Yes," he said. "She probably will be." He left it there. Not because he had nothing else to say, but because he had said the necessary things, and anything further would have been performance. He went to the back of the house and sat with the sound of the October wind and stayed there until the particular tightness in his chest loosened into something he could breathe around. The conversation with Renata did not go smoothly. Claire had it by phone, from the bedroom, and Daniel heard none of the words but understood the shape of it from the duration and from the way Claire emerged 40 minutes later, with her face composed in that way she composed it when she had been managing someone's reaction and was now managing her own. She said it was fine. She said her mother understood. She said they should move on. Renata Whitmore did not understand, and they did not move on. In November, Renata called Daniel directly. He answered because he had no reason not to, and because he was someone who dealt with things rather than avoided them. Renata spoke for 8 minutes with impressive fluency about the emotional labor she and Gerald had invested in supporting the purchase, about how families share things, about how the house had always had a larger significance in her mind, about how she was simply trying to preserve something. She did not yell. She was warm even. But the warmth was a texture laid over pressure, and Daniel had enough experience with her to read it clearly. "Renata," he said when she paused, "I want to be respectful of how much you care about your family. I also want to be honest with you. The house belongs to Claire and me. The deed reflects that. There is no arrangement to renegotiate, and I'm not going to negotiate it. If you'd like to visit, we'll set up something that works for everyone. But I need this conversation to be the last one about ownership." The warmth cooled slightly at its edges. "I hope you understand how this feels from our side," she said. "I think I do," he said. "I imagine it's uncomfortable. I'm sorry for that." She said goodbye politely. He set down the phone and stood in the hallway for a moment, feeling neither victorious nor relieved, feeling, mostly, the dull weight of having done a necessary thing. December passed. Then January. Claire became quieter in a way that was difficult to name. Not distant, exactly, but turned slightly inward, as though she was conducting some extended private argument with herself that she could not yet resolve. She was reshaping things, he understood. She was building a version of the story in which her intentions had been good, and her execution had simply been misread. He watched this process the way you watch someone work through grief. Not with judgment, because grief has its own logic, but with a kind of careful attention. He had changed too, though, in a direction he found harder to track in himself. He had stopped filling silences the way he used to, that habitual reaching for conversation to smooth over gaps. He let the gaps be. They did not feel hostile. They felt, more often, like honesty. In February, Gerald called, brief, a little stiff. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings. Daniel said he hoped so too. It wasn't entirely untrue. He had spent 3 weeks reviewing the deed, the property records, the utilities, in both their names. Not because he had anticipated a legal dispute, but because he had realized, somewhere in December, that one of the reasons this had been allowed to drift so far was that he had not been paying sufficient attention to the things that were his to protect. This was not paranoia, it was the opposite. It was the particular clarity that arrives when you stop assuming that because something is right, it will be recognized as such without effort. He also, in those months, thought quite a lot about Claire, about what it meant that she had let it go as far as she had. He did not arrive at simple conclusions. She had been trying to manage an impossible space between the people she loved, and she had done it badly, and she had known she was doing it badly and had kept going anyway, which was a recognizably human failure. He could hold that truth, and also hold the other truth. That trust, once it shows you its seams, requires renegotiation. They had not separated. They had not slept in different rooms or had a conversation with the word divorce in it. But something had shifted in the architecture of the marriage, and both of them could feel it, and neither of them had yet found the language for what came next. Valentine's Day. They ate at home. Claire made pasta, the same dish he'd made the night he'd first found the email. And he wasn't sure if this was intentional or not, and he didn't ask. After dinner, she said carefully, "I know I handled it wrong." "Yes," he said. "I kept telling myself I was protecting everyone." "I know. I wasn't actually protecting anyone, I think. I was just avoiding." He looked at her across the table. I know that too. She nodded slowly. The candle between them had burned low, the wax pooling. Outside, February did what February does. Indifferent, cold, just enduring its own season. I don't know what we do from here, she said. He said, neither do I. But I think we have to say that out loud before we can figure it out. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, okay, and it was the smallest and most honest thing she'd said to him in months. March brought the first warmth, thin and provisional, the kind that arrives before you've fully stopped bracing against the cold. They drove to Pelican Cove on the second weekend of the month, just the two of them, the way it had always been in the beginning. The house had been empty since October. A neighbor had agreed to check on it through the winter, and things were largely as they'd left them, a layer of dust on the counters, a slight mustiness that 3 open windows corrected within the hour. Daniel walked through the rooms slowly, while Claire unpacked, running his hand along the windowsills, checking the caulking near the back door the way you check on a living thing. The house was fine. The house had been fine the whole time. They walked on the beach that afternoon. The season had not fully turned. The water was iron gray, cold-looking, and the beach was nearly empty except for a man throwing a ball for a retriever at the far end. Their footprints pressed into the hard sand near the waterline and were erased by irregular waves. They didn't talk much. The silence had changed in texture over the past months, or perhaps he had just recalibrated his reading of it. It was no longer the careful silence of people avoiding things. It was something closer to exhaustion, and exhaustion, he had come to understand, was a form of honesty. They've stopped calling, Claire said. She didn't specify who. I know. My mother she's hurt. She won't say it that way. She'll say she's disappointed or that she doesn't understand. But it's hurt. That's her work to do, he said, not unkindly. I know. A pause. I spent a lot of time this winter feeling like I was being asked to choose between you. You were never asked that. No, she said. I did it to myself. I think I'd been doing it for years, actually, and I just kept the math from adding up, so I never had to see the total. He was quiet for a moment. The retriever at the end of the beach was barking at something in the water, a distant sound. What was the total? He asked. She stopped walking. He stopped too, and they stood facing the water, not each other. That I'd been giving everyone just enough of myself to keep them satisfied and not enough of myself to actually be present. Including you. Her voice was even. She had worked up to this, he understood, had practiced the shape of it, maybe, or at least sat with it long enough that it no longer required armoring. I thought that was good management. I thought I was skilled at it. He didn't say anything for a while. A wave came in closer than expected and stopped just before their shoes. I used to think the problem was your family, he said finally. And then I thought the problem was the house, the legal situation. And then I thought the problem was trust. And it partially was. But he paused. The thing underneath all of it is that I didn't know how to tell you I needed something different. I kept waiting for you to see it and you kept managing, and neither of us said the actual thing. What was the actual thing? He turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her but near her. That we'd gotten very good at being together and stopped being curious about each other. And I didn't say it because I didn't have language for it. And because I was afraid if I said it out loud it would become too large to manage. The sound of the water filled the space between them. Is it too large to manage? She asked. He considered this seriously, the way he considered problems that mattered, not rushing toward reassurance, not retreating into vagueness. I don't know, he said. I think it depends on whether we're willing to start over a little, not from the beginning, but from honesty. Claire picked up a small, flat stone from near her foot and turned it in her palm without throwing it. She held it for a moment, then set it back down on the sand, not throwing it. Just returning it. A small gesture, strange and private. I want to try, she said. I need you to know I mean that. Not as management, not as damage control. She finally looked at him. "I actually want to try." He met her eyes. There was something there that he recognized from years ago, not the romance of years ago, not the clean-slated certainty, but something rawer and more honest. The face of someone who had run out of performances and was simply, finally, here. He didn't say "I love you" because it would have sounded like conclusion, and nothing here was concluded. He said, "Okay, then let's try." They stood there a while longer, not touching, not needing to yet, watching the iron water go about its ancient, indifferent work. Behind them, the pale blue house held its shape against the gray sky. It was still theirs, legally, formally, and in every sense that the deed had always said it was. That part had never been in question, not really. What had been in question was everything the house held inside it, the silences, the accommodations, the careful distances, the language that had grown too practiced to carry real meaning. None of that was resolved. It would not be resolved quickly or cleanly or in any way that would make a satisfying ending. But Daniel Hargrove understood. Standing on that cold beach in early March with his wife a few inches away and the ocean going on without them, that resolution was not the same as ending, and that the willingness to stay in the difficulty, to remain inside the question without demanding that it answer itself, was perhaps the most honest form of love he had ever found. The retriever was still barking, far down the beach. The wave came again, and this time it reached them. Neither of them moved.